So because a muscle may contain hundreds of motor units, muscular tension can be varied by changing which motor units are active, activating the fibers with them. But what is the name for the process of activating additional fibers of the muscle? So everyone got this correct. This is recruitment. Remember, recruitment is the ability to call on additional fibers, additional motor units, which have those associated fibers in order to increase force generation. So that's correct. All right, let's look at another one. Oops, what happened? Here we go. Fifteen seconds left. Great. So what are the properties of fast glycolytic muscle, which has less red blood vessels and mitochondria and dominates in white meat? Most of you selected B. B is fast, strong contractions that fatigue quickly. So this is correct, right? If we think about fast glycolytic, remember the first name of the muscle is its speed of contraction. So right away we can eliminate C and D. The last name of the muscle is its main source of ATP production. So glycolytic means that it relies mainly on glycolysis, right? So anaerobic glycolysis, and just to associate anaerobic glycolysis with the buildup of lactic acid, that is where we get the easy fatigability from. So that price to pay of fast, strong, quick contractions is the buildup of lactic acid, because you're making ATP anaerobically in the absence of oxygen. And so that creates the burn. So these muscles are more likely to fatigue. All right, so that would be B. All right, let's do a few more. About 10 seconds to go. All right. In addition to helping improve health in certain disease states, such as diabetes, what does aerobic exercise do to healthy muscles? Okay, so we had a few different responses here. The responses were sort of split. Majority for A. A says increases mitochondria and muscle fiber diameter. Now, right away, those two things are conflicting, right? Because if you increase the mitochondria, then you're increasing the reliance on oxidative phosphorylation. And we know that that process requires oxygen. So if you were to increase the mitochondria, then you need to decrease the fiber diameter, because the fiber diameter is a barrier for that diffusion of oxygen. So A already has conflicting features, right? Let's see, B, decreases mitochondria and increases glycolytic enzymes. We know that is not true. in the nature of the word aerobic, we know that there's more reliance on oxygen. So decreasing mitochondria and then increasing glycolytic enzymes is the opposite. That would be for glycolytic muscles. C says increases mitochondria, glycolytic enzymes, and muscle fiber diameter. Again, the first feature and the last feature are conflicting. And then obviously glycolytic enzymes is also conflicting with mitochondria. And then D says increases mitochondria and decreases muscle fiber diameter. So D makes more sense, right? D is that we're training the muscles to rely more on oxidative phosphorylation. These are activities like swimming, like jogging, anything where we can maintain that rate of respiration. As a result of that, we're increasing the mitochondria in order to allow for that oxidative phosphorylation to take place. We're increasing the oxygen because we know that oxidative phosphorylation requires oxygen. And we're also going to have to decrease the muscle fiber diameter so that that oxygen can diffuse into the muscles. This also means that the muscles are going to have more blood vessels, right? More blood vessels to deliver that oxygen, and then more myoglobin, which is how that is stored in those tissues. So this is going to be your dark meat. This is going to be more oxidative phosphorylation, more myoglobin, more mitochondria, reliance on oxygen. And these are going to be muscles that deliver slower release of energy, more sustained release or contractions. And then some of these types of activities here would be like long distance running, anything where we need to do this for a long period of time and have that slow sustained contraction. So D is the correct answer here as far as aerobic exercise and how that trains muscles. And this is just to kind of tie in here, this is why physicians, especially heart physicians and heart doctors will tell you to do more aerobic activities because it's healthier on your vascular system. It encourages blood vessels to grow. It encourages muscles to have a smaller diameter, which is less of a burden for your cardiovascular system. So that's kind of why we encourage heart healthy exercises like aerobic ones. Okay, let's go on to another one here. Right, 10 seconds left. All right, let's see. Okay, interesting split with the responses. So pretty much each response was selected. Let's see. So what is the feature that makes cardiac muscle different from skeletal muscle? In other words, what are some unique properties to cardiac muscle that we don't see with skeletal muscle? So the majority of you went for D. It is extensively connected by gap junctions, okay? And this is true. Let's look at some of the other options. It has no striations. That's not true. So both skeletal and cardiac muscle are considered striated muscle because of the presence of the sarcomere. So the sarcomere are these striated units, right? These parallel units that give both cardiac and skeletal muscle their striated appearance. And as a result, smooth muscle doesn't have this, and so that's why we call it smooth. So that means B is true as well, the presence of sarcomere on both. C, its contractions are not regulated by troponin tropomyosin system. That is not true. So both skeletal and cardiac muscle have contractions that are regulated by the troponin tropomyosin system, those regulatory proteins. The way that those proteins are involved in regulation is different, and the structural organization of troponin and tropomyosin are also different in those two types of muscles, but they are both present on the sarcomere in both of those types of muscles. So the gap junctions is the unique feature that we see only in cardiac and smooth. So it's in cardiac and smooth muscle, especially that single unit smooth muscle. And it's really important so that the muscle acts as a unit. And this is why we cannot see recruitment with cardiac muscle, right? And that kind of doesn't make sense. We want the heart to be functioning as a single unit. It has such an important, such a vital role that cardiac muscles must act synchronously. And so the presence of gap junctions is really important for that. Skeletal muscles can be graded, right? We want some weak contractions, some strong contractions, depending on the type of load. But with cardiac muscle, we want all of the muscle acting synchronously. All right, one last question here, and then we'll start. All right, 10 more seconds. All right, let's take a look. Okay, what is the primary purpose of the cardiovascular system? So a few different responses. A and D are equally split. So A says to bring oxygen and nutrients to cells, certainly a vital role of the cardiovascular system. D says all of these are equally important, right? Let's see what the other two options were. B, cellular waste removal, and then C, hormone transportation. So the correct response here is D. All of these are roles or functions of the cardiovascular system. So most of you went for A, and A is certainly one of the more important roles of the cardiovascular system, delivering oxygen and nutrients. But we also want to think about removal of waste like carbon dioxide. That is also achieved with the cardiovascular system, and then moving other things around in the blood like hormones. Okay, so this is an interesting segue right into our final chapter, right into our final unit, which is the cardiovascular system. We're going to begin by looking at the anatomy, some of the structures and the function. We'll talk about the cardiac cycle and get into the physiology of the heart. And then lastly, we'll look at some of the mechanism, right? So some of the electrical physiology of how the contractions occur. So our first objective is to have a general understanding of the components that make up the cardiovascular system. Some of this may be a review for some of you guys, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. We're going to talk about what components make up this system. So first of all, we've got the heart, right? What is the heart? Who can describe in their words what the heart is? We know it's muscle, but what else are some good descriptions of the heart? All right, muscle that pumps our blood throughout the body. Excellent. So I'm really glad you used the word pumps our blood throughout the body, because the heart is essentially a pump, right? It's a muscular pump. Its main role is to eject that blood all throughout the body, and then it's going to receive that blood to come back and eject it again. So the main function of the heart is to provide the force that allows the blood to travel really far. It has to go all throughout our peripheral system, all the way to our fingers and toes. And so that's going to need quite a bit of mechanical force just to kind of push it out and make sure that it gets to all of these distal areas. So the heart is one of the main components. The blood vessels are also important. They're going to help to act as a conduit for flow of this blood. And then obviously the blood, which is the component that is circulating. And then in the blood, we know that there's a lot of important substances, oxygen, which our tissues need, especially our mitochondria, right? We know that the main role of oxygen is for oxidative phosphorylation, right? To act as that final electron acceptor. So the way that oxygen gets to all of our cells and tissues is via the blood. Nutrients, right? So all of our biomolecules, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, they are delivered via the blood as well. Waste product from cells to the liver and kidneys. This could be breakdown products, byproducts from the foods that we eat, carbon dioxide, which is the waste product after cellular respiration. Other components like our immune cells, white blood cells, hormones, clotting proteins, other specific target proteins, hormones, enzymes, all of these things are transported as components within the blood throughout our entire system. So the heart has quite a few structures that help to bring this function about. Right. Let's point out some of these parts of the heart. I don't think you guys will do the anatomy of the heart until, if I'm not mistaken, or if this hasn't been changed, until AMP2. So this will sort of be a precursor to some of these structures that you'll talk about in the labs next semester. But we'll point out some of the major components of the heart. First of all, this is the heart. Right, it's this large muscular pump. It's got 4 chambers. 2 of the chambers are on top. So here's our right atrium, and here's our left atrium. The atria are considered receiving chambers because they receive blood that's coming back, whether it be from the vascular systemic circulation, which is the entire body, that comes back to the right atrium, or it be blood coming back from the lungs that comes back to the left atrium. So these 2 chambers are on top and they receive blood coming back. The ejection chambers are the 2 chambers at the bottom. These are the ventricles. So there's the right ventricle and then the left ventricle. Now the ventricles receive blood from the atria, and then the ventricles eject that blood back out into the circulation. So on the right side of the heart, the right ventricle is going to eject blood towards the lungs. And then the left ventricle is going to eject blood to the aorta, which goes out back into our systemic circulation. So the 4 chambers of the heart are separated and they only communicate atria to ventricle. So there's a one-way directional flow so that the blood is continually moving in one direction. Some of the major vessels that are important are the vena cava. So the superior vena cava brings blood back from our head and upper extremities to the right atrium. The inferior vena cava brings blood back from the rest of our body, the abdomen, the pelvis, the lower extremities, also back to the right atrium here. The pulmonary arteries, they're leaving the right ventricle and taking blood out towards the lungs, right? This is shown in blue. So although this is called an artery, this is shown in blue because the pulmonary arteries are taking deoxygenated blood back to the lungs so that it can pick up new oxygen and then come back to the left atrium here. So these pulmonary veins, they're going to be drawn in red, but they're carrying oxygenated blood, although they're called veins. They're bringing that freshly oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the left atrium, okay? Then we have the aorta, which is that main vessel. It's one of the biggest, thickest vessels in our body, taking blood from the left ventricle out to the systemic circulation. And then that will deliver oxygen to our head, neck, and then the lower limbs, etc. So this is sort of just a simplified view of the heart, the chambers, and some of the major vessels that are leaving the body. The last thing I want to point out here before we move along is the valves. So the valves are what help to make sure that blood is flowing in one direction. So here we have the right tricuspid valve, also called the AV valve. AV because it separates the atria from the ventricle. So it's also called an atrioventricular valve, but it's uniquely named the tricuspid valve on the right. And then the left AV valve, also separating the left atria from the left ventricle, is called the bicuspid valve on the left. So these are both AV valves, and they help to make sure that blood is only going from the atria down to the ventricle and not in the opposite direction. The other two valves are the semilunar valves. So this valve here, which is in between the left ventricle and the aorta. So the aorta is sort of behind the pulmonary artery here. And then so that's the aortic valve, the semilunar valve here is called the aortic valve. On the right side of the heart, the semilunar valve is called the pulmonary valve, and that separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary arteries, which are going into the lungs. So this is just an overview. We'll go over this again and again. I know we talked about quite a few structures here, but they will come up again as we describe the circulation of blood. So let's look at an even more simplified schematic of the circulation. And we want to understand there are two different circuits or two different circulation systems that are in the body. So the heart is in the middle, and I've drawn a really simplified view of the heart. And then we have the pulmonary circulation, which is where the lungs deliver oxygen. And then we have the systemic circulation, which is where the capillaries absorb or remove that oxygen from the blood. So let's walk through what happens when the blood leaves the heart and kind of how it goes all the way around and comes back. So blood goes from the left ventricle, it's ejected into the aorta, it goes out into our large arteries and then into our arterioles, and then eventually it's going to make its way into our capillaries, which are the smallest blood vessels. From there, there's going to be an exchange of oxygen and nutrients. So oxygen and nutrients will be delivered or dropped off. Carbon dioxide and waste will be picked up in the blood. And then now we're going to take that blood back into our smallest capillaries once again, then eventually to our small veins, and then which are called venules, and then eventually to our large veins, and then they come back to the right side of the heart. So this is delivered to the right atrium, and then it goes down into the right ventricle. On this side, it's blue because it's deoxygenated. It's devoid of oxygen, and this needs to get back to the lungs so that it can pick up new oxygen and drop off this carbon dioxide that it's carrying. So from right atrium through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, and then out into the pulmonary arteries, which is where it goes to the lungs. So here in the lungs, this is another site of exchange, capillary exchange. The lungs are breathing in fresh oxygen from the environment. They go all the way down to the alveoli. Eventually, they cross the alveoli into the capillaries in the lungs, and then the carbon dioxide is picked up. It's delivered into the alveoli, into the lung system, and then that carbon dioxide can be breathed out. So this is how the lungs play an important role of exchanging these gases. It's picking up carbon dioxide so that we can breathe it out into the air, and then it's delivering fresh oxygen so that we can circulate that. Then that goes into our pulmonary veins, and then back into the left atrium, and then down into the left ventricle. And that happens again and again and again. Blood is going through the systemic circulation, dropping off oxygen, picking up waste, and then going back to the heart, and then going into the pulmonary circulation, picking up oxygen, and then dropping off waste.